right, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome back to the Foreign Correspondents Club. I'm Kristie Stout. I'm a correspondent board governor with the club. I'm a longtime fellow member of the FCC and also an anchor correspondent with CNN. And we have a very special lunchtime panel discussion where we're focusing the light on modern day slavery, which is real. It's immense. It's also happening in our own backyard. The International Labor Organization says some 50 million people are now enslaved around the world. That is a 25% increase from the last estimate in 2016. And there are a number of factors behind that. The climate crisis, conflict, even the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in widespread unemployment and made a number of people very, very vulnerable to human trafficking. But today we are going to focus on a very particular form of human trafficking that's targeting professionals in Hong Kong, all across Asia, to work in these cyber scam compounds in places like Cambodia and elsewhere. It's a very frightening and ever-evolving form of human trafficking. And joining me on the panel are the following individuals. We have Matt Friedman, who is an activist, CEO of the Mekong Club, also an educator. Patricia Ho, an educator as well as a human rights lawyer, and Cesare Podkol, educator and also investigative journalist with ProPublica. So let's give them all a very warm welcome. And we thank all of you for being here today, for expressing interest in this topic. Before we kick off the conversation, and we'll have about half an hour of talk time before we open it up for general audience Q&A, we want to air just a 3-minute report that we recently filed on CNN, produced by FCC member and my producer, Jaden Sham, who joins us in the audience, which also had the input of all 3 panelists that you see on the stage, including Patricia, who offered her legal analysis on camera. So without further ado, why don't we roll tape and take a look at this report.
Maybe you've seen one before, a friendly text from a stranger that could be the beginning of a cyber scam.
These cyber fraud companies are doing all kinds of scamming. The first company I went to was looking for Chinese people. They were tricking them to invest.
Lu Xiangre worked as a cyber scammer in Cambodia against his will. He was lured to Sihanoukville with the promise of a management job, only to be held captive, forced to work as a cyber criminal.
More than a dozen security guards were out there with guns. We were not even allowed to step out of the door.
We spoke to people from Bangladesh, China, and Taiwan who all say they were trafficked by cyber scam companies, and they all share a similar account. They were lured by a dream job, forced to scam with fake identities, and some even sold from company to company.
All of them are mostly educated, because to conduct scam is very different from other type of job that you just need labor.
According to the International Labor Organization, 50 million people worldwide are now enslaved, up 25% from the last estimate in 2016. Experts say cyber scam traffickers have exploited unemployment from the COVID-19 pandemic to lure tens of thousands of people.
Taking advantage of joblessness was one thing, but also taking advantage of the fact that people really wanted to travel. So the idea that you could travel somewhere for a job project was something that was quite exciting for many.
China, Indonesia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Vietnam have all issued warnings about high-salary job offers from Cambodia. Hong Kong authorities are warning travelers at the airport of scams and have set up a dedicated task force for victims. But many victims are too afraid to ask for help.
We have to find ways to encourage them to go to the authorities. Giving them immunity from prosecution is an absolute necessity.
Cambodia has acknowledged that foreign nationals have been trafficked by cyber scammers and carried out high-profile raids. But activists say many large-scale operations are still running.
It is still ongoing. I mean, there are raids that maybe 1 or 2 just kind of showcasing to the international community, but it was nothing compared with the whole scale.
Lu managed to escape when he contacted local officials. He became a volunteer rescuer, determined to help others avoid his fate.
And what is your message to people who think, this would never happen to me?
You can earn $20,000 US for one person you scam. Many would be willing to do it, even if it means selling their relatives and friends.
Lu is one of the lucky ones. Activists say thousands of others remain captive, trapped by a dream job that turned into a nightmare. Kristie Stout, CNN, Hong Kong.
Okay, now that story, it aired just a couple
Reaching
months
net
ago
zero
on
CO2
CNN.
emissions is the challenge of our generation.
We don't need to watch the next one, thank you. For something that we call My Freedom Day, which is a day of student-led action. We partner with schools all over the world just to raise awareness about the problem of modern-day slavery, and Matt, you've been very, very active in that initiative. But this story about cyber scam linked human trafficking, it really came to the fore last year. It was widely reported that also forced governments, especially Cambodia, to crack down on the issue. It doesn't mean that the story or the problem has gone away. In fact, just the opposite. So I wanted to pose a question to all three of you first. Where does this issue, where does this problem stand now? And Matt, we'll start with you.
So I heard about it for the first time in Laos about 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was kind of local people that were getting caught up in this. And it wasn't something that we paid much attention to. And then all of a sudden, as you say, around, I guess it's been about a year or 14 months, this topic of young, educated people through either love, triangle type things, or a great opportunity for job were lured to Cambodia. They got there. When they arrived, they basically had their documentation taken away from them, and they were put in a scam center. Initially, the criminals, when they set this mechanism up, thought that they could just pay people a lot of money to do this. But a lot of Asian people don't want to kind of scam other Asian people, and so trafficking became the way to do it. And a lot of this also came about as a result of COVID, where you had a bunch of people who were quarantined, the criminals as well, and as a result of that, they basically could not basically do the usual things they did. They realized that every 10th person that they have a conversation with, they could get them to give money. They could just cheat and steal certain things. If we had a bunch of people doing, we could make a bunch of money. Last thing I'll say is that what's interesting and both scary about this is that two separate crimes have been brought together. Scamming's been around for a long time. You know, you've seen it for 20 years out of Africa and different parts of the world. Human trafficking's been around, but scamming or trafficking into scamming is new. And what happens is people are held in place, and as a result of being held in place, people say it's like an ATM machine, because as long as you get them to continue to do things, then you get the money and you can make a lot of profits from that.
Yeah, and it's still happening because of just how lucrative it is. Patricia, your thoughts on where the issue stands now?
I thought I would just ask everyone around here, if you don't mind, how many of you received messages on your phone inviting you to invest on something over the last 6 months? So this is, I think, after the issue came to light.
Yeah.
And it appears to me that this trend is only on the rise. And I find it frightening that even after all the media spotlight on the issue, not just in Hong Kong, but huge spotlights in Taiwan and around different regions in Europe, that it's still so rampant. Yeah. I mean, the level of audacity there is with these criminal networks behind these homes where they house a lot of these victims must have quite some power, I imagine. So the way I see it is that it's on the rise. And I'll just add one little story. Unfortunately, I recently had been approached by my refugee clients who themselves have been scammed. I thought, wow, what? I've got a refugee child who's around 16 years old, and thought that she would help her dad with, bringing some cash into the home, and then invested a couple $1,000s that she found somewhere, and then quickly spiraled. She talked to her church about this amazing investment opportunity, got the church's funds involved. And then not long afterwards, this girl basically was involved in helping herself, her family, and the church lose about $200,000.
Oh, wow.
To these syndicates. And I mean, it's just such a frightening thing when the most needy people are targeted as well.
A quick follow-up question before we get an opening remark from Cesare. You mentioned, and we saw the show of hands just now, virtually every person in this room has been touched or targeted by a cyber scam operation. A refugee client, a child refugee client of yours, has been targeted to a devastating effect, as we heard just then. do we have an understanding of the people behind the scenes who are doing the cyber scamming? How many of them are doing it against their will? We heard from Matt. He said Asians don't like to tricking other Asians, don't want to be taking part in this type of work. Do we have any understanding of just to what degree is this enterprise making a lot of money being supported by bonded labor, by modern day slaves?
I personally don't think I'm able to begin to apprehend the scale of this.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe you have more of an idea. But I will say I just found some stats from government answering public inquiry questions.
This is here in Hong Kong.
This is here in Hong Kong. The Security Bureau confirmed that they have arrested 31 people in 2022 who they actually termed victims of trafficking. And they all happen to be Hong Kong residents. And because of the timing and everything involved, I'm certain that the 31 people identified as victims of trafficking were people who were abducted or conned to go to these cyber scam facilities over the last few years, returning back into Hong Kong. What's interesting is we don't know if they've been prosecuted for anything, but they've been identified as victims.
And that number is also unusual to you because how does it compare to previous numbers in Hong Kong?
So previously, according to government statements, we've never had any victims of trafficking in Hong Kong. I mean, every year there's a countable few, 1, 2, 3. And then suddenly, in the last year, it's 30-something, and they're all Hong Kong residents. So just I mean, this reflects lots of other issues which maybe we can go into, but certainly they're more ready to view them as victims as opposed to people from other places.
Thank you. Cesar?
Yeah, I agree with Matt and Patricia. It's definitely, absolutely still a problem. So last year, I think it's up on the screen, I spent most of last year working on this lengthy investigation for ProPublica on this very topic. Traveled to Cambodia for that and interviewed human trafficking victims who were lured to work in these scam factories from China and Vietnam, and I interviewed people from Malaysia. I think there's 3 things that are different now versus last year in terms of how this problem is evolving, not going away, but just evolving and shifting. One is that a lot of these scam operations have now shifted and are operating out of Myanmar. A lot more people are being trafficked into Myanmar. They get lured for a fake job, told to report to Bangkok. They fly into Bangkok, and then they're trafficked across the Moe River into these scam zones all along the Moe River, the border between Thailand and Myanmar, which is essentially lawless and a really scary place for them to be. Yeah. So that's one thing that's different. A lot more of these operations are now in Myanmar. I think it's still happening in Cambodia as well. It's kind of gone underground because of the crackdown, but Myanmar, I think, is the next place where it's really, really evolving. Secondly, I think the human traffickers are casting a broader net in terms of the nationalities that they are recruiting. As I mentioned last year when I did this story, I interviewed human trafficking victims from Vietnam, Malaysia, a lot of Chinese. Now you're seeing them go to places like they're recruiting people from Bangladesh, India. You're hearing about Ethiopia. I've interviewed people as far away as Brazil. Wow. People from really far away places that are lured into these fake jobs and then forced to scam. And then thirdly, I think, and this is really kind of the scariest question of it all, is how the scamming tactics are evolving. Because just like you saw, everyone raised their hand. Like we all get these messages. And at a certain point, if everyone's aware that there's scam messages going around, the tactics have to shift and the scammers have to evolve. How are they going to utilize ChatGPT for this is a scary question to which I don't know the answer. But how they're going to utilize technology differently to make these messages more realistic, more believable, to engage with all of you and everyone more, so that if they send out 100 of these messages and 99 of them fail, as long as they get one, that's the payday they're looking for. There was I was sharing with you earlier, there was a story out of in Canada. A woman in Canada lost the equivalent of $7.5 million Canadian dollars, so like what, 44 million Hong Kong dollars to one of these scams. If you get one person like that, you're in business. If 99 or 1,000 messages fail, but you get one where they get someone, that's what they're looking for. So they're constantly shifting their tactics. And I think that's the other scary element of it, how they're going to continue using AI to further these scams.
Yeah, as you just laid out, this is a form of human trafficking that is ever evolving. Yeah. Myanmar is now emerging as a new hotspot, especially in the wake of the crackdown that took place in Cambodia. But you also, let's put a human face on this phenomenon by talking more about the victims. Cesar, you talked about the victims being recruited outside of Asia, even in South America, Africa, elsewhere. All of you have either interviewed, represented, or supported victims of this form of cyber scambling, human trafficking. And let's start with you, Matt. If you could tell us more about the victims. Who are they, and how did they get entrapped in this situation?
Well, there's basically two victims here. There's the human trafficking victims. And the interesting thing about this is, you know, I've been working on the issue of addressing human trafficking for 35 years. And a lot of the people who end up in trafficking situations come from difficult circumstances, and they struggle through life and so forth. And to a certain extent, even though what they end up with is extreme, they've developed a certain amount of defense mechanisms to cope with what the situation is. You take a person who's college educated, comes from a particular socioeconomic situation, never had any defense mechanisms in the world, and then you put them into this very extreme, violent taser, you know, beatings and everything. They're totally unprepared. I've seen dozens and dozens of videos and interviewed some of these people who they just said, my life is ruined because all of a sudden this trauma has had such a devastating impact. On the other side of the equation, I know two people who've lost $1 million. These are people who, one of them was a banker, and they bought into it, you know, because what you have here is a situation where the scammers will get you to get things off of Apple or Google. So it's real software, and you know, the websites look exactly the way it's supposed to be. They get you to put 20,000 US in. 2 days later, it's 40. They're like, oh my gosh, wow. You know, and then you're thinking about, well, if I live to 90, I'm going to need a lot more money, so maybe this is my opportunity. Nobody really knows anything about it. They're so good at lying and just having that element of hope be built into it that the person goes further and further. And they call it pig butchering, because the idea is that you're expanding the pig to the point where you get it to the nth degree, and then when you feel like, even after they borrowed money, so they put all their life savings, then they borrowed, and you don't think you're going to get any more, then it terminates, and it stops, and that's it. And my son, I mentioned this to you, is an emergency room doctor, and he has to tell people that their loved ones passed. I know bankers who now are saying, I have to do the same thing. Tell these people that they've lost everything and they're not going to get it back. And they say it's similar to that, because when you're talking about your entire life savings being gone, wow, that's a really horrific situation for any family or an individual.
You know, just quickly, my producer and I, we spoke to one victim of this form of human trafficking who told us after he was able to do a pig butchering scam, he brought in the victim, the transfer of money took place, he messaged the person and he said, I'm sorry. My boss knows that I have to keep talking to you. Please do not give me any more money. I've been forced to do this against my will.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about the victims who you've represented who are involved in this type of scam-linked abuse?
So what I've noticed is that the people that they've been targeting within Hong Kong has usually been people who speak multiple languages, maybe IT savvy, so that they could really level up the way these scams look like. I know that there are individuals who worked in Hong Kong U who have ended up falling, sort of kidnapped into such scams. And the way that they've been lured into it, I've heard different statements from the authorities saying that, you know, you shouldn't fall for job ads that say you'll earn a lot of money within a short time. I mean, not everyone does that. What I found is that people have just been abducted. They've been invited to go to a holiday, and then they ended up having guns pointed at them and thrown into a truck and then taken to these facilities. But yeah, I would say, however, comparing the experiences that Hong Kong victims have gone through with victims from other countries, that it seems that Hong Kong victims have had a relatively easier ordeal. I've heard that in Taiwan, a lot of these victims have been forced to produce, they have a quota that they have to meet. So they have to make a certain amount of money. And if they're not able to do that, then they have to ask their families to pay these traffickers the amount of money so that they'll be let go. And a lot of people, if they've not been able to generate that sort of money, they've had their limbs cut off and things like that. So that's probably how the fears really spread. And also within these facilities as well, because all the people trapped within these facilities just don't really know what might happen to them, and they all end up doing whatever they feel that they could. I heard a similar story about a middleman in Hong Kong who felt just so bad about sending somebody over that the moment the person went over and was in touch, the middle person tried to give clues to the other person so that they would recognize what's happening and then assist the person to come back to Hong Kong as well.
Wow.
So I think, it's quite clear that a lot of these people are really struggling with what am I going to do and feeling completely bondaged in these situations.
Yeah. It's very chilling when you speak to the victims and you ask them about the moment when they realized that this was not the job that they signed up for. And they describe a situation where they're brought into a very dingy looking office. They're told, this is your cubicle, you have one PC, you have 9 cell phones, you have handfuls of SIM cards, and for today, your name is Judy, you're an attractive Chinese woman based in Vancouver, this is your Instagram account, you're doing a love scam, go. It's very scary. Cesare, you were so generous and helpful with introducing Mr. Liu, who we profiled in the piece, and who you interviewed also here at the FCC. And he's also a very brave individual too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tell us about the people who you've talked to and interviewed, including him.
Yeah, it's the humanity, the human suffering at the core of the story is, I think, one of the things that makes it just so fascinating and so tragic. One of the things that we were conscious of with this story, and I think goes back to something you mentioned, Matt, when I interviewed you for the article last year, which was that there's this double hurt at the core of it. We have victims on, here in Southeast Asia who are trafficked into these scam factories, and then victims all around the world. And I think the statistic that we cited in this story last year was from the Global Anti-Scam Organization, which represents victims of these pig butchering scams. They had identified at the time I did the report victims in over 40 countries. I'm sure that's higher now. But basically, this is a global phenomenon. And it's one of these rare stories where you can really pitch your editors on what's happening here in Southeast Asia and directly connect it to your home market in terms of whether your outlet is based in the UK, the US, Canada, wherever. I mean, it connects to people globally, all over the world. The human suffering, one of the things we were conscious of with this story was we wanted to show both sides of it and humanize victims on both ends, because the US scam victim we profiled in this article was a man in California who had lost $1 million of his family's savings, including borrowed money, and just it drove him to the point where he was suicidal for a while because it just completely devastated all his life plans. His daughter's college savings account, everything was just wiped out. So we showed that side of the suffering, and then in Cambodia, when I was doing these interviews, I heard so many stories of the type of corporal punishment you mentioned. And Fan, the Chinese human trafficking victims we profiled in this story, shared, being witness to people being beaten publicly in front of everyone else just to, make others afraid, to follow directions, do as you're told, continue scamming, don't question what, just do it as you're told. So the stories of people being shocked with electric shock batons, that's absolutely real. I mean, I interviewed some people where, I asked them where they could show you the burn marks on their body from electric shock batons, which is really frightening. So that kind of suffering, that you see on both ends in different ways is just really, really, just frightening. And the other thing that I would just add in terms of, the other people that I've spoken with, is that there is kind of a continuum to this as well, where some people may be tricked into this and they don't want to do it and they just want to get out. There are also people who will, when you're under this sort of pressure, they will at some point just begin to do it willingly because, they figure, okay, they can stay safe if they follow directions, and they just kind of convince themselves, maybe it's not that bad. You don't know the person on the other end of this phone conversation or whatever. And some people start doing it willingly, and then they become part of this, So there is a sliding scale. And I did interview one Vietnamese human trafficking victim who was tricked into this fake job ad, just like what we've been discussing. He was in Cambodia in this Chinatown complex, and he at a certain point just decided they were paying him a few $100s a month, and he was just took the money and was able to send some money back to his family in rural Vietnam, and he just sort of did it for a while and just, you know, kind of convinced himself that it wasn't that bad until he tried to get out, at which point he realized, you know, he had the, you know, he was held for ransom and he was beaten and shocked and everything. So it's just, it's a uniquely terrible situation for so many reasons.
It's a horrific situation. Crackdowns have taken place, high-profile raids of these scamming centers in Cambodia. Hong Kong government last year set up a task force, you know, police officers at the airport, even stopping and assisting travelers before they go to places in Southeast Asia and say, are you going there for a job opportunity? What is the nature of the job? Just be aware that this is taking place. This is the emergency hotline or WhatsApp. But what more needs to be done? As you mentioned, it's going underground, it's flaring up in places like Myanmar. What more needs to be done to address this horrific but also very lucrative criminal enterprise?
Let me just start off with human trafficking in general. As you said, went from 40 to 50 million, mostly because of COVID, desperation, which resulted people from using all of their savings because they didn't have a job, and as a result of that, they borrowed money, and then traffickers come and take people away. But counter-trafficking movement's been around for 35 years. Last year, the world helped 100,000 out of 50 million people out of modern slavery. That's 0.2%. That's not even 0.5%. We've been doing this for 35 years. Part of the reason for this is that, you know, the legislation and the responses and everything kind of trickles along and it moves forward, but not at the same pace as the people who are doing the bad things, because they don't have to follow rules and regulations and everything else. For this particular thing, I mean, if you look at the response that the world had to terrorism and how all of a sudden banks can talk to each other and law enforcement can come together, I don't know of any other thing that is more of a terrorism than what we see here with these scam centers or even human trafficking. So, you know, as a person who's worked on this for 35 years and we're still at 0.2%, you know, something radical has to happen. We just have to kind of wake up and say, enough is enough. Yeah. You know, we need governments to act, we need people to understand this, and we need to figure out what legislative changes needs to be done to put it into a category like trafficking, I mean, anti-terrorism, where people can act and do things before this gets out of hand. Because once again, all you have to do is get a person, hold them in place, and it's an ATM machine. If you threaten them, if you basically say if they don't do something, something bad's going to happen, this is a great business if you're a criminal. There's going to be franchises all over the world. If we don't nip this in the bud right now, we're going to have some real problems in the future. And what scares me is that there's so many other distractions that maybe that's not going to happen. So maybe 20 years from now, we'll be having a talk about this, talking about how this is one of the most prevalent things that we have, and it's out there, and nobody's really did anything, and we don't know what to do about it. We don't have to be in that place.
Yeah, raising awareness and also creating a sense of urgency.
Exactly, urgency is the term for sure.
Yeah, Patricia.
For me, I think based on the types of victims that we've met, it's essential for the government to be playing the role of gathering intelligence and sharing intelligence. I think in many ways, you know, a lot of people who read the news would learn about these tactics and scams alternatively. But for a lot of the types of people who are targeted, they probably are the type of persons who need to hear these things from the government. What's interesting to me is recently, if you ever drive past a tunnel, you'll hear ads about how, you know, don't fall for telephone scams and things like that. I mean, it's a good sign because it's reflecting that the authorities are actually seeing this as a very serious and widespread issue, such that they have to make these announcements in the tunnels. And this is happening across radio stations as well. The problem, I think, is that the government's quite slow at the moment in gathering this sorts of intelligence. And this is related to the second issue, which is that they have to be quite open to receiving intelligence from victims who may well be perpetrators at the same time. There's this huge overlap, right? You know, all of these people who have been held in camps in Myanmar, but they managed to come back to Hong Kong, a lot of them would definitely be guilty of various cyber scams and various crimes in Hong Kong. Does the Hong Kong authorities treat them as criminals or as victims? very, very difficult legal questions, but that has to be sorted out. What's definitely been introduced around the world in many of the main common law jurisdictions is that there are defenses available to victims to say that certain crimes were committed in the course of them being victimized or forced to do certain actions as a typical victim of human trafficking. But such a defense is not available in Hong Kong. And the result of that is not only that it's extremely unfair to the individual, because they might end up being thrown into jail for a very long time and not be able to actually put forward the full picture of what actually happened to them. But the other thing is that because the authorities turning a blind eye to the full picture, they're not able to gather the type of intelligence needed to then help them to understand how to move forward in law enforcement, how to protect individuals, how to warn people from falling into this further. So for me, these are probably some of the main things I would like to see changing.
So there needs to be some form of legal immunity to protect the victims, to encourage victims to speak out, which would then enhance the intelligence that the government needs to act on this. Cesare, I wanted to get your thoughts about what's needed to better crack down on this practice.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. Raising more awareness so that people realize it's a scam and don't get tricked into human trafficking would be a huge step forward, as would adjusting the legal standards so that there's a better defense available. One that I'll add on top of that is I think law enforcement has a huge role to play here. And I'll share some good news. So the US scam victim we profiled in this story, the man I mentioned earlier who lost $1 million, he was able to get back around a tenth of that, around $113,000 that local law enforcement in California were able to recover. It was amazing to see them do that, and it just shows you that it is actually possible for law enforcement to trace the crypto, because all of these scams are being, or vast majority of them, I shouldn't say all, but vast majority of them are being perpetrated via cryptocurrencies. The scammers are teaching their human trafficking victims, people they recruit to convince people on the other side of the world to deposit funds into various cryptocurrency wallets and then take those money and invest it into cryptocurrency website that's of course a sham. They control it, and once they transfer the money, it's gone. And they really cannot. The victim themselves cannot do anything to get it back. And any money that they give to the scammers to try to unlock it, like if you pay a tax of 20%, we'll give it back to you. Any money you send, it's just there's throwing good money after bad. But what they can do, the victims of these scams, is if they report it early enough to law enforcement can actually go ahead and trace the flow of funds along the blockchain and see where did that money end up. Did it end up in some wallet that they can then try to freeze and seize the funds through an asset forfeiture proceeding. And a local prosecutor, Erin West at Santa Clara County in California, has had great success doing this. She's now giving talks and educating other law enforcement how to do this, and they've had some success doing this. So it's not impossible to trace the money and figure out where it went and try to do an asset forfeiture proceeding and try to recover some money for the victims. That doesn't mean they'll get all of it back, because I don't think anyone has gotten all of it back, but they may be able to recover some of it if they do report it early enough. And I think that's something that's an emerging trend with law enforcement, for them to be able to do this on a larger scale. The U.S. Department of Justice just announced they seized $112 million this way of cryptocurrency funds in April. So it is possible, and law enforcement is having increasing success doing that.
Yeah, justice through following the money.
Yeah.
And a quick follow-up question for you, Cesare, before we open it up to audience Q&A. For those who are journalists, media professionals, or those interested in the media in the room, what is your advice to them and to us in terms of covering a story like this?
Yeah, well, first of all, don't assume that there's nothing left to cover, because this is an emerging, as we've all mentioned, this is an emerging situation. It's ever evolving and shifting in ways that are just constantly demand more coverage. So the story isn't done yet. The story is only just beginning. We've only scratched the reporting that we've done. The story that I did last year. That's really kind of just the beginning of where this problem is right now. And so there's definitely, first thing is definitely there's more reporting to be done. Second, just be very careful when you're interacting with people who are either being scammed or have been forced to scam. Just be careful not to get scammed yourself. You make sure you vet the information that they're giving you, just like you would with any story. Trust but verify. And then thirdly, if you're talking to human trafficking victims, just be very mindful of what they've been through, right? These are people who are going to be sharing some of the worst experiences of their life with you. So be compassionate. Try to put yourself in their feet. Don't push them to share information that they're not comfortable talking about. Make sure, you know, you set appropriate ground rules to make sure they're comfortable, you know, speaking about what happened to them in the way that they're comfortable speaking about it. And don't assume, you know, especially if they've already come home and they're back in, you know, their home country, don't assume that everything's great now and everything's fixed, because there's a lot of trauma that they've experienced. And, you know, one person I talked to when he went back to his home country, and I checked in with him how his life now is just, it's never been worse. You know, just like it gets worse every day, you know, because it just turned his entire life upside down being away from his family, you know. So don't assume that just because they're home, everything's great, because it could be just the beginning of a long, long, painful recovery process for them.
Yeah, thank you for that advice. Now we want to open it up for Q&A. Hopefully there's some questions in the audience, anything that you would like to ask any of our guests. Here we go, question in the corner. A microphone coming your way.
A question for any or all of the speakers. What is it, or what was it about Cambodia as a country, or as a society, that led to the emergence of this kind of scamming in Cambodia?
I can start with that. During the pandemic, you had certain criminal groups that were already there because they were kind of leaving other locations where perhaps there was pressure on them. So they, like everybody else, were quarantined and held in place, and they started experimenting and realized that they could do this. And because there was the potential to set up these scams without a lot of kind of local involvement of law enforcement and politicians. And in fact, if you look at some of the exposés, I won't go into naming anything, you have a situation where local officials see that there's a fair amount of money that's being made, so they turn the other way and so forth. And so it just became a right place to be able to do that type of thing. The other thing is it's kind of exotic, you know, kind of like Thailand and Laos and Vietnam. People want to go there and travel. You know, a lot of people who get scammed, they don't necessarily have to have the job or have the money, but the idea of getting paid a nice salary and being in an exotic place like Cambodia, well, that's kind of cool. Let me go ahead and do that type of thing. After it kind of got exposed, you had governments putting a tremendous amount of pressure on Cambodia, and so it's kind of a push-down pop-up. It started to go down, and then it popped up in Myanmar and Laos and these other locations. And so, you know, the coverage was there for a duration of time, but then it waned. And it's because, you know, it peaks and then something else comes up. There's been a lot of news stories out there. Just to add to what was stated about journalistic kind of oversight, is that this should come up periodically on a cycle to just give a general sense of the fact that it still exists, it's still a problem, and this is where it is now. You know, so you don't have to obsess with kind of lots of coverage, but it shouldn't be one of these things that only happened for 4 months back in 2022, and that's the last of it. We should see bits and pieces of this in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just add casinos. I mean, if you just follow wherever there's casinos, organized crime tends to follow. And Cambodia had, you know, for several years before this happened, had opened up its doors wide to gambling, casinos, online gambling, and that whole industry had built up. Then the pandemic hit, the casinos emptied out, and there were all these empty buildings. What do we do? And a lot of the organizations that had come there, you know, turned to online cybercrime as a way to sort of, you know, keep making money. And so unfortunately that was one outgrowth of that.
Yeah, a number of the victims we spoke to would say, yeah, they were, I was recruited for an IT job at a casino in Cambodia. I did my research, I looked up online. There are casinos in Cambodia. Unfortunately, the news wasn't updated that the casinos had shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of the exotic nature of the location, they were promised, you will have a gym, a personal trainer. There's also a swimming pool. And it became this dream job. At a moment coming when they needed it the most, they wanted to travel, they also needed the income, and they took it.
Yeah, and same thing in Myanmar, casinos,
I would just add one more thing to that, which is that Cambodia and Myanmar, they've had very experienced traffickers for decades. Yeah. I mean, after the Pol Pot regime, country falling apart, there just not being a clear support network for for people and everyone being desperate. It's just the type of environment where it's ripe for exploitation. And I think what you find is with experience comes ideas, and it's very creative what's happening. It's a genius sort of idea. So it's coming out of, I think, decades of experience.
They actually have manuals that are in both, depending upon the language, Khmer or Mandarin or English, that they're this thick, and they say this is what you say under this circumstance. There's flow charts. You know, organized crime is organized.
Yeah.
In this particular case, it's very organized.
I think there was a question over here. Let's get the mic to this individual. Thank you.
Hi. I'm trying to understand the psychology behind this. So, you know, I think if I were to think, oh, someone got scammed out of some money, right? At first blush, I would think, oh, maybe someone who maybe was lived in a small town, maybe not very educated. But we're talking about people who are losing tens of thousands, millions of dollars here, right? These people are clearly well-to-do. How does this actually work? Like, how do you convince somebody that you've never met? Like, what is the thinking behind this? Like, are they consulting with counselors? Are they consulting with psychologists that they're able to get somebody to trust them at this length, especially for people who are forced into these jobs, so don't even have these backgrounds. Like, it's so unfathomable to me that people are losing this much money, and that this works on so many different levels. Can you walk me through a little bit of that?
Yeah, a question on how the scam is done.
That's a good question, and I was wondering the same thing when I did this report last year, because that was something I just couldn't figure out. I was talking to, because I interviewed several dozen scam victims, just to find the right one to profile, and someone who'd be willing to talk about their experience, had a compelling story. And in the process of doing those interviews, I was just shocked, because I was like talking to really smart, educated people who, by all accounts, you know, some of them told me I should have known better. You know, some of them had PhDs. They worked as consultants or, you know, business executives. Like, people had, like, you know, good education, good, you know, like, you know, strong, you know, family, social network, and all of a sudden, like, they fell to this scam and lost their whole life savings. And so it all comes down to psychological manipulation. And I discovered that. I had this light bulb moment when I took some of these text messages between the scammers and the victims, and, you know, with their permission, I shared them with a psychologist who specializes in cybercrime. And that was so eye-opening, because she went through this and she pointed out all of these textbook psychological manipulation tactics. Oh, here's this, here's that, here's this one. Oh, here's what he's doing here, here's what they're doing there. And then, you know, I thought to myself, well, how do these, you know, how do you know how to do that if you're just, you know, if you've just been trafficked into this job, you've been tricked into this? And the answer was, actually, it's not the human trafficking victims doing that kind of elaborate ruse, at least not at the outset. What a lot of these human trafficking victims we've been talking about, what they do is the low-level intake. They'll be asked to create fake online personas, and they'll be given a quota. Start, you know, do 60 lines of chat messages with 20 people a day or something like that. Yeah. They'll be given a quota, and just keep talking to people, keep initiating chats, keep creating fake profiles, fake profiles, fake profiles. And then once they stumble onto someone like the victim, U.S. victim we profiled in this story, the man who lost $1 million, once they hit someone who's engaging, and they're actually engaging, then the criminal boss takes over. You just, like, literally just hand the phone over to the boss, and the boss now takes over. And the boss has done this enough times. The boss knows what buttons to press, and he knows how to manipulate the victim. In the case of this person, he was, his father was dying, and the scammer discovered, oh, you've got a dying father. Well, don't you want to provide for, you know, you had some brothers and sisters. Well, why don't you take the inheritance, and why don't you invest the inheritance so you and your siblings will have more money? And that was that, you know, don't you want to do this for your father? Do this for your father. And it was like that kind of psychological manipulation that took him. This is a person who was scared of didn't want to even do $2,000 at the outset, and found himself plunging $1 million within like 6 weeks. And it was like, it went down to psychological manipulation.
Wow. We need to wrap up our conversation, and I believe that when we talk about a subject as harrowing as human trafficking and modern-day slavery, I think we should leave it on a note of agency. I think every person in the audience would think, well, what can I do to help? What can I do here? But I'd like to phrase the question this way. What are the signs of someone being in a human trafficking situation? It could be scam-linked or not scam-linked. What can anyone in this room do if they suspect that they see someone who could be entrapped in this type of situation?
Something sounds too good to be true. It probably isn't, you know. And going back to your point or question, there's two things here. There's hope and trust. So you can generate the trust, but people want a better life. People want an opportunity. So there was a particular scam victim who I knew was being scammed. And I had conversations with her over and over again. She said, yes, but this, yes, but this. Because the scam people had addressed all of those things. I got this from Apple. I did this. It's a legitimate site. You can see it. It's real. It's real. It's real. And then, you know, finally she tried to press that button and it was over. So because she so hoped for this to be something that, and she was thinking about all the things she could do and she could have a better retirement. It was all about really wanting something. So that hope is a scary thing because it clouds all of the good judgment and practicality and logic that we should put into things. So you really have to stick with these people and just basically help them to understand that in this world, it's very, very rare that that opportunity that's going to allow you to double or triple your money exists anywhere. Maybe there was times in life that it did, but not now. And, you know, read these articles, watch these exposés, watch the video that we said, and just try to open your mind to the fact that something bad could potentially be happening.
So hope clouding the judgment or, you know, the vision of these people who fall for the scams, but also fall for the people who want to do these jobs.
Exactly.
And they think it's a dream job and it turns into a nightmare.
Exactly the
Final
same.
thoughts from you, Patricia?
I think for me it would be an appeal to journalists. So much of people's awareness of the types of things that can happen is based on what they hear and see in their medias. So, you know, it would be an ideal thing if we could continue to see updated strategies being reported across different types of media platforms. I mean, the ones you like and the ones you don't like. I think that would be the only way I can see for people to be on trend and actually understand the evolving situation. Whatever we say now may not be useful a couple months down the road.
And continue to keep in tabs with the journalists in your lives.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Whenever there's a new wrinkle to the story, as it were. Cesare.
Yeah, I would definitely invite everyone to, you know, sustain coverage, more coverage of this topic from other news outlets, but also in your personal life in terms of, like, if you spot someone who's falling for either an investment scam or you think they're about to take a job abroad that may be a scam job, I think the winning argument very often could be, you know, just seeking that second opinion from a trusted friend. Like when I think back to the, you know, the scam victim we profiled in the story, if he had just gone to more people in his personal life to say, hey, what do you think of this? Do you think this is real? Should I, you know, if you're just getting that gut check from a family member, a husband, or wife, or, you know, like someone who could look and be like, no, don't do it, right? Or even if it's like, hey, I've got this job offer, should I go to Cambodia for this? No, don't. It's, you know, like getting that second opinion from someone could trust could be the crucial step that saves you from making a terrible mistake.
Yeah, well, Cesare, Patricia, Matt, that was such an important conversation. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insight and sharing it to all of us today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
And a couple of gifts from the FCC. You do get the FCC tote bag with swag inside. So let's pass it around. There we go.
Oh, wow, nice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Oh yeah, sure.
Wow.
No, you don't need to show off the swag.
The swag, yeah.